Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first training for art literacy this year, 2023 to 2024 at Lake Grove Elementary. I'm Teresa Aguilera. I am a co-coordinator of art literacy this year at Lake Grove, and I'm very excited to introduce our first artist for October, Sandro Botticelli. So it's pronounced Botticelli. He's an Italian Renaissance painter. He's actually was known by his nickname. Sandro Botticelli is not his real name. His real name was Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Pepi. Botticelli means barrel in Italian, and his older brother was actually called this because of his large size, and the name sort of stuck. So it's kind of a funny thing if you want to talk to your kids about going by a nickname, being known forever by your nickname. That's what happened. Their whole family adopted it, and that's who we know today. This is a portrait of Botticelli that was not made by him. It's made by another artist in a book about artist lives named Giorgio Vasari. Botticelli lived in the 1400s. He's an Italian Renaissance painter. We'll talk a lot about him in the context of other Italian Renaissance painters. And I'm going to present a third to fifth grade version of this. We may end up with a K to second grade version of the presentation that has a little bit more, a little fewer, more like interactive questions for the kids. You're welcome to use either one in your classes. So Botticelli was born in Italy and lived during Italian Renaissance, as I mentioned. Here is Italy during the Renaissance. This was a period of cultural rebirth, and artists played a really big role in that. So in a question for your third to fifth graders might be, can you name any other Renaissance artists? Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci are a few that we probably have learned about in previous art lit sessions who are working around the same time as Botticelli. He is different, though, in a few key ways from other artists during this time, and we're going to spend a little time today explaining how his unique talents and view and approach contributed to new ideas in art. So one way that Botticelli was different is he spent most of his entire life in just one city, which is Florence, Italy, represented here again by a different artist, by that same artist, Giorgio Vasari, who did the woodcut in the first slide. But Botticelli was born in a tiny, modest neighborhood called Ognissanti, and is buried in a small church there. So if you happen to be there, the church still exists, the street still exists, you can go see where he grew up. Other artists tended to travel across Italy doing commissions and special projects, but the furthest that Botticelli ever went to paint was at the Sistine Chapel. 25 years before Michelangelo painted his first frescoes there, Botticelli was invited to paint. Michelangelo's work overshadowed that, but you are welcome to go see that. His work, a lot of his work is still there in frescoes. So he wasn't very famous outside of Florence until his work was rediscovered and had a renewed interest in the 19th century. Now, something to know about Florence is that it was a very wealthy city at the time, lots and lots of money in the city, lots of political power in Italy. But Botticelli's family was not wealthy nor powerful. His father was a tanner or a leather worker who later worked as a goldsmith. And his work as a goldsmith actually brought the whole family into contact with a lot of artists because gold was very, very common as an embellishment at the time. Botticelli used gold in some paintings that we'll see later, usually on commission, where the person who bought the painting would be paying for that. And he may have been trained in goldsmithing himself, which plays a role in the use of some of his techniques. So here's a self-portrait of Botticelli. If you're doing for younger kids, you might even say, here's a painting Botticelli did, and ask something like, what do you call a painting you do of yourself? Who's done a painting of yourself? Those prompts will be in your slideshow. This is actually a small part, also called a detail, of a much larger painting called The Adoration of the Magi, which we'll look at later. This portrait shows Botticelli gazing directly at the viewer, and his face is turned at 3/4 view, which was really customary in portraits at the time. Artists at the time believed that this angle kind of allowed artists to reveal more of the subject's personality. And so he was known also for doing this, but something that's different about Botticelli is just the really penetrating stare he would give his subjects. And it's often referred to as a very humanistic approach. He tried to make them really natural seeming. And we'll create one of these kinds of looks in our hands-on project. Something to know about Botticelli is that he is known as the master of line. And even though his other portraits are similar in some ways, his use of line is one way his portraits are very different from other artists at the time. So you can note in this version, this picture here, the exacting contours of the face, the neck and facial features, and the eyes and lips being really outlined. They're very defined on the edges. And the details of the flowing curls and the hair are equally delineated with fine lines, the folds of the robe. You'll see these things come up again in future pictures. And some people think that Botticelli's expertise with line might have come from working as a goldsmith, in which you rely heavily on line and shape because there's no real color or contrast you can do with metalworking like that. So this is a thing to focus on as an element of art as part of this lesson. A line is one of the seven elements of art, and it's considered by many to be the most basic element of art, the very fundamental thing that makes art possible. And a simple way to think of a line is to imagine a point that moves. It's basically a moving dot. So we'll see lines again here. This painting is called Judith with the head of Holofernes. Can you name some ways Botticelli uses line? Is a question you might ask of any grade. And just see if the students are able to pick up things like line here to define features of the human form, for instance, those facial features like the eyes and the lips, to convey three-dimensionality. So in the fabrics of their dresses, the lines are used in a way to suggest that there's a shape underneath that dress. And also to draw the viewer's attention to the subject. So the way that the trees are sort of bending towards the women and the lines of their arms are framing their bodies. And then finally to imply movement. So kind of going with that thing about the fabric, the fluttering and swirling fabrics are made with these rapid contour lines, which identify the folds of the clothing and pressing against those shapes. And it makes it look like they're moving forward. And that's something that was very unique at the time of when most people were painting very static images. Botticelli also used contrast in his work, and this is another one of the key points that we want to make in this lesson. Contrast in art is using unlike visual elements in juxtaposition or kind of in opposite or comparison to each other to create meaning and intensify the characteristics of the work. So it's taking two different things, putting them side by side, and that kind of forces one to notice the differences. So contrast has often been called the golden rule for creating art because it's one of the best tools to engage a viewer. If line is just drawing attention, contrast is really making viewers view meaning in a single piece of work without having to have multiple pieces side by side. And artists utilize various elements to create contrast. They can do it through shadows or light, or color, as you're seeing here, or size, as you're seeing here, and also composition. And also ideas is another one to note. So you can actually have two opposing things representative of each other, something light, something dark. I think the light side, the dark side of the Force. If you're a Star Wars fan, similar kind of idea. So putting those two things side by side, that's a contrast of ideas. And Botticelli plays with all of these types of contrast in his paintings. So we'll call those out as we go through the next few images. This is a painting called Fortitude. And this is actually Botticelli's earliest documented work. It's pretty stunning for somebody so early in their career. Who knows what happened to his earlier paintings, if there were any, but this was painted when he was about 25 years old. And can you name some ways Botticelli uses contrast in this painting? Is something you might ask your students. So some of the answers here might be color. The bright red fabric against the neutral whites and blacks really draws the viewer in. Shape. You'll notice that the geometric wooden elements up above and below the person in the frame are really setting off the more organic, natural shapes of the person, who is very flowy, very fluid and organic looking in the human form. The shadows, the deep shadows imply depth and push the subject to the forefront, and then light. The colors are luminous, almost like they're glowing in comparison to some of the elements behind that are deep in shadow there. This is a portrait called Man Holding a Medallion of Cosimo de' Medici. And you will hear Medici come up a few times if you've studied Italian paintings, Renaissance painters before. They were often the patrons of the artists, paying for their family in great political power and paid for a lot of art and other creative endeavors to happen in Florence. So in addition to allegorical and biblical subjects, Botticelli became a sought-after portraitist, and that is what we'll do our hands-on project about. So it's worth lingering on this one a little bit. Early portraits were primarily of high-ranking, well-known personalities from France. We actually don't know who this person is, but he's holding that medallion, which was, I think, meant to imply protection from the family, uh, uh, for the family, like of the family. And due to his success with these early paintings that we just looked at, the one like Fortitude, for instance, Botticelli came to the attention of the Medici family, and they shared a common interest in a human philosophy known as Neoplatonism, which basically just explored Greek and Roman thought in sculpture and painting. And some of the key things they did was playing the Christianity-based imagery against pagan imagery like Roman and Greek mythology. And you'll see some of that in future paintings. Maybe not something to bring up with the younger children who aren't going to be as aware of that kind of thing, but it could be a conversation with the older students. So this half portrait's unusual for its time because it contains a landscape in the background. Botticelli usually used a plain background, and it's one of the first portraits that we know of to show someone's hands. The medallion shape in his hands actually also is not painted. That is actually a cast stucco piece that's been inserted onto the wood. So something you might ask some of the older grades is what techniques you see here that we've already talked about. And those things are hopefully contours or outlines. So use of line, you can see it in his hair, in his eyes, and the lips there. No one really has lips that are that outlined with that kind of lip liner exactly in real life, but it's here and it's really making a contrast of the in his face. There's contrast of light and shade to create a sense of depth. And the subject of the three-quarter pose with the eyes directed at the viewer is something we saw in that very first self-portrait. A question you might ask the K-2 grades is what geometric shapes you see in this painting. And of course, there's a circle in that medallion. You can also kind of ask them to see other less obvious geometric shapes that are implied in the composition. Shape is something that comes up in this presentation a lot, but we didn't pull it out as a specific key thing to focus on. We wanted to focus on the light, the line and the contrast. But if you kind of blur your eyes, you can see there's a triangle made by this shape because of the contrast of the light and the dark in the foreground and the background. Okay, so this one is a pretty different painting. Many artists portrayed their patrons in all their riches and finery in famous biblical scenes, like particularly this one of the three kings, the Magi. The thinking at the time was that by placing the family in a religious scene, they kind of had their wealth sanctioned, it brought them closer to God and raised their status in the community. So these paintings were very, very popular. Certainly Botticelli was not the only one making these. This became very popular in the Renaissance and continued to be popular with wealthy patrons for a long time. And Botticelli himself painted this exact scene, the Adoration of the Magi with the three kings, 5 times. This is the first or the most famous, of them. And the patron who commissioned this wasn't even a Medici, although a lot of the Medicis are pictured in this image. The work was commissioned by Gaspare da Lama. And Botticelli wanted to show that person's connection to the powerful family. So that he is here in the white. There's Botticelli, and there's da Lama, and the white hair, and here's the rest of the Medicis. So something you can ask before you hit that forward, you can see there's animations on here. Something you can ask the kids is, can you spot Botticelli? Because this is actually the painting where we saw his self-portrait. He's the figure on the far right there that we saw at the beginning. Here's some more portraiture. This is one of a Medici, Giuliano del Medici. He was assassinated in a failed attempt to take power. And portraits across the city when that happened were there's a lot of details there we're not going to get into in this presentation, but the portraits were commissioned as memorials and warnings to other plotters. And this one was likely commissioned by him before his death to commemorate his sadness over the death of his own beloved, Simonetta Vespucci, who actually is a woman that Botticelli modeled a lot of his women off of. But it inspired the rest. And so it's kind of an iconic one of the time. A fun question here, trick question, similar to the where's Botticelli in the last one, is there's a dove in this painting, and can anyone spot it? Hopefully the screens in the classrooms are high enough resolution you can actually see these. I know the light makes it hard sometimes, but the lower left corner there's a brown dove. And this painting's full of symbolism, so it's a good place to introduce that idea here. because Botticelli loved to include this in his work. So doves mate for life, and it is actually perched on a dead olive branch. So that's very symbolic of the situation that this Medici found himself in. The open window was a symbol of death at the time, and the eyes cast downward is pretty unusual. We talked about them usually looking directly at the viewer, so this is very unusual and probably symbolic also of death or sadness. And again, you can point out lines, contrast, facial features, and fabrics have these really defined lines, lots of contouring on the face, which you'll want to notice and use later in the hands-on project, and the contrast of the pale face and the dark hair. Here's another version of the Adoration of the Magi, painted at the height of Botticelli's career, possibly while he worked in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So a question here that's interesting to ask is where all the compositional lines lead to in this painting. So if your eye is drawn in by lines, what are those lines and where are they leading? They're really leading to that center focal point with the baby Jesus. And this painting expresses another way that Botticelli differed from his contemporaries. He did not care about actual perspective, about realistic perspective, which was a big thing at the time in the Renaissance. Was mathematics and perspective. That's not something he was after. Instead, he used architecture to invite the viewer to enter the painting and highlight the focal point and draw the attention. He used it to manipulate the viewer's gaze. And the use of line here is obvious, and you look at it in the ruined temple, obviously, but there's also organic lines created here by the people, the way their bodies are bending to the middle, and also by the way that they are looking towards the center. So kind of implied line. Botticelli also composed his paintings to match the shape he was painting. That earlier Fortitude was painted on an oddly shaped wooden panel. This is a round one. It's known as tondos, or which is Italian for round, and they were popular in the 15th century to decorate people's homes. So they'd be painted on wood like this, and then they'd be framed with these gold frames up in the corner. You can see that. They often depicted the Madonna and Child, so that biblical imagery, and they usually used gold as a decorating detail, not only in the frame, but in the painting itself. So here you can see gold in the rays of the sun, in the crown, in her cape and her hair. This has a lot of gold in it, more than most, and someone very wealthy probably commissioned it in order to pay for all of that to be included. So a question for especially the older children, but probably the younger ones would get this too, is how does the round shape of the painting affect the placement of the figures in it? If you were painting this, and they were standing straight up like they might be usually, they'd really be cut off. So the way that he's adjusted it here as all the people are leaning inward, framing Mary and Child, and the arms are curved to match that circular shape, kind of this repeating motif of these circles kind of framing around. And it's just a very pleasant composition, even though it could feel very forced because it's such an unusual shape to paint in. Okay, now we're getting into some of the big ones. This one is one of Botticelli's most widely known works, La Primavera, the allegory of spring. And it's a good time to talk about allegory if you're up for it. An allegory is a story or a poem or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. So you can kind of see this again, this theme of like some hidden things in here. Botticelli painted several mythological paintings like this one, which are based on Greek and Roman mythology. And they're very representational. This one's got the harmony of nature and mankind, and it tells a story from right to left. And I know right to left might seem unusual, but he's using that line and visual movement to draw you from the right to the left is the thinking. So the visual movement to go through it on this one starts on the right with the bent lines of those trees. Then you go into that kind of blue guy, the green, which is the south wind Zephyr pursuing the nymph named Chloris, the nymph of springtime. And then when she's captured, and then you see there, I think with Child potentially, but covered in flowers, certainly, that is her changing into Flora, the goddess of flowers, which is a symbol of Florence as well. And then your eye is drawn to Venus in the middle, the goddess of love, who's the central theme of the painting. And note that her tilted head kind of looks a little like that Madonna in the last ones. You see that overlapping of reuse of some of those same themes in visual language. And directly above her is a blindfolded Cupid shooting an arrow towards chastity, which draws your eyes back down towards the three graces, which are chastity, beauty, and passion, dancing in their feet, barely touching the ground. And then on the left there is Mercury, the leader of the three graces and the god of the winds, lifting his magic staff in the wintry clouds away as he makes way for spring. So definitely not something you're going to pick up if you're not aware of Greek mythology, but if you were, at the time it was a very popular pastime to know about those things. you might understand this as a story. So some questions, there's a lot of questions on this one because this is what they often call the scanning image, which is the primary image you want to focus on in the lesson. Very representative. So a question that's fun for all is how big you think this painting is. These images are actually life-size. The figures are life-size. So this is a really enormous painting, all made in tempera paint on wood. And tempera is fun because that's something that even kids use today. Another question is maybe more fantastical. Does this look like a place you could visit? There's really no wrong answer here. The background is, an orange orchard, which I think is representative of Florence again. There's a lot of flowers. It could be someplace you might visit, I suppose. And then do these look like real people? This is kind of the crux of it. So there's no wrong answer to this exactly, because certainly they look very realistic, but just as Botticelli manipulated perspective in buildings and things like that in the last image we saw, he often modified human forms also in order to create graceful lines or beautiful shapes. So he would manipulate the human form into things that were completely unrealistic. Arms and proportions are longer than realistic and exaggerated. Look how long Venus's arm is. Poses are impossible to achieve or to sustain. The three graces, it's impossible for anyone to hold themselves into those positions. And this is sometimes referred to as idealized beauty. This is where that idea comes from, that maybe there are things that we're trying to attain and cannot get to. That's not what Botticelli had in mind. He certainly wasn't saying everyone should look like this. He was more interested in just realizing the beauty and figuring out how to have it be represented and how to make his paintings the most beautiful they possibly could be. So there will be a series of other questions in the slide notes for this one. If you want to pick a few out ahead of time and ask them, you can. Don't feel like you have to. I know this has already been about 20 minutes of presentation. It's about all the kids will be able to take. So feel free to cut any of this out that you want. That said, we'll breeze through a few more. So this is Pallas and the Centaur. This is another allegory that was hung together with La Primavera. So it's, again, very huge life-size figures. It shows Pallas Athene, the goddess of wisdom, next to a centaur, that mythological creature with the body and legs of a horse and the torso, arms, and head of a man. And this is meant to represent, again, she's the goddess of wisdom, representing love of knowledge, and the centaur is meant to represent earthly pleasure. And so it's a study in contrast. That idea of contrasting ideas is very much present here. So she represents reason, he represents animal instinct, she stands out against the sky, and he's kind of muted against that wall, and the static lines of the wall and the halberd are really in juxtaposition with the flowing lines of her body. There's a detail of some of the line work in the hair. This is the other big one. So The Birth of Venus is considered Botticelli's other masterpiece, along with La Primavera. Again, he was less concerned with the correct anatomical depictions of the figures, and he really focused on their graceful movements and fluid lines to tell the story of the composition. Famously, of course, her arm is incredibly too long. What is going on with the neck? Really not exactly a human body you would find. But on first glance, it's just a very beautiful piece, and he's trying to represent an idealized beauty. So this tells another story. You can get into it if you wish, but basically Venus has emerged from the sea on a shell that's driven to the shore by the flying wind gods, Zephyrus and Aura. They're showering down roses. Roses here represent their spring flowers attributed to Venus. This may be why they're attributed with love. And there's a nymph bringing her a robe. So it's kind of a little story that you would know if you were into this mythology at the time. And he's also depicting two opposing forces, the movement of the winds and the nymphs kind of coming together and stabilizing this creature, this figure in the middle. So some questions you can ask here are what lines and shapes are dynamic and which ones are static. So her hair, the fabrics are dynamic and flowing. The oceans and the line are kind of implying movement. The lines of the shell are dynamic and energetic, and the trees and horizon are static and provide contrast. And here's a detail of that. This is a good one to linger on because we'll be wanting to use some of these techniques. You see on her face, she's got lots of outline around the chin. The face is outlined, the eyes are outlined. You've got line use in the hair, of course. And using the hair, especially, we're using line to show movement here, which is something fun to introduce into the portrait project. Yeah, so she's so ideal in her beauty, we don't really notice her long, long neck until we take a closer look. And here's one more portrait to prepare for the hands-on project. This is in some of the slides for that. This is portrait of a young man. In this case, he omitted the background and to focus on the person, which is what we'll have the kids do. It's in sharp contrast to the background, and it really kind of shows his personality, kind of a, not a very excited face, but you feel like you might understand that there's a real person here. He's not wooden, he's very organic. And it's a good example of ideals for facial proportions. I won't read them out because I think it's more fun and easy to do rather than see. Great. So now we're ready for the hands-on project. I'm just going to get some things into shape here. And I will start the video. Is that working? Oops, actually not sure how to do that. Let me stop sharing.